One of these men gave his father a gun as a gift. 4 months later, that gun killed him. One of these women can't remember recording some of her own biggest songs. One of these legends had a doctor sleeping in his house just to knock him unconscious every single night. These are 10 R&B icons the world thought it knew completely, and the darker story hiding behind every one of them. Subscribe now, because number 1 isn't just the most tragic story on this list. It's the one where the danger was already living inside the house. The countdown begins now. Number 10, Chaka Khan, I'm Every Woman, 1978. Chaka Khan is 25 years old, the voice of Rufus, one of the most technically gifted singers alive, and by her own later admission, already sliding into a cocaine addiction that the entire industry around her treated as normal. Here's the part that should stop you cold. Khan has said publicly, more than once, that there are entire recording sessions from this era she has zero memory of. Not foggy memory. None. Vocal takes exist, credited to her, released to millions of people, that she cannot personally confirm she remembers singing. Think about that for a second. Somewhere in your music library right now, there is a piece of Chaka Khan's voice that Chaka Khan herself cannot verify. A vocal run you've hummed in the shower 100 times, laid down by a woman who was somewhere else entirely, while her body did the singing. This wasn't a secret struggle hidden in the shadows either. Cocaine in late 70s and early 80s recording studios was so common that some producers reportedly budgeted for it the same way they budgeted for studio time. It wasn't whispered about in back rooms. It was on the table, literally, in some sessions, treated as a tool of the trade rather than a warning sign. Labels didn't intervene. They didn't have to. The records kept selling. The tours kept booking. And an artist unraveling in plain sight was simply good for business as long as the vocals still landed. What makes Khan's case different from almost everyone else on this list is the sheer talent involved. This wasn't a fragile voice propped up by studio tricks. This was one of the most technically dominant instruments in the history of American music, somehow still performing at an elite level while its owner was disappearing in real time. That contrast, genius on autopilot, running on muscle memory while the mind checked out, is something few artists have ever admitted to as plainly as she has. Khan got clean years later and did something almost nobody else on this list did. She talked about it plainly, by name, without softening it into vague industry language like a difficult period or personal struggles. She named the drug. She named the years. She named the cost. That kind of honesty, decades after the fact, with nothing left to protect and no album to promote, is rare enough that it deserves to be said out loud. Chaka Khan has confirmed she cannot remember recording some of her own released material, meaning fans have owned pieces of her voice for over 40 years that she has no memory of creating. But addiction wasn't the only way this industry could take something from an artist in an instant. Our next story is about a man who lost his entire physical identity in a single second on a wet road, and had to figure out who he was after that.
Yes.
Number 9, Teddy Pendergrass, Turn Off the Lights, March 18, 1982, Philadelphia. Teddy Pendergrass, 31 years old, at the absolute peak of his career, loses control of his Rolls-Royce on Lincoln Drive. The crash leaves him paralyzed from the chest down.
You're the only one in the world that I need.
Here's what made this so uniquely cruel. Pendergrass's entire brand, the 4 women-only concerts, the sold-out arenas, the reputation as the most physically commanding performer in R&B, was built on his body, his movement, his presence, the way he filled a stage without needing to say a word. In one instant, on a road he'd driven 100 times before, the exact thing that made him a superstar was gone, and it wasn't coming back.
A sexy mood.
And it wasn't just his legs. The injury reduced his lung capacity, meaning the instrument he sang with, his actual voice, had to be rebuilt from scratch. He had to relearn how to breathe into a microphone, how to support a note without the muscles he used to rely on without thinking. Imagine spending 20 years mastering an instrument, and then waking up one day to find the instrument itself has changed shape.
Cozy.
The industry's response, in hindsight, tells its own story. There was public sympathy, plenty of it, magazine covers and well wishes and benefit concerts. But structurally, there was very little in place to help an artist whose entire image had to be reconstructed overnight. He was largely on his own to figure out what came next, in an industry that has never been especially patient with artists whose bodies stop cooperating with the brand.
You're the only one in this whole.
He came back. In 1984, 2 years after the accident, he released Love Language and kept recording for 2 more decades, eventually returning to the stage in a wheelchair, refusing to disappear quietly the way the industry might have preferred. What almost never made the interviews was the psychological cost underneath that comeback. The quiet mourning of a version of himself he was never getting back, absorbed almost entirely alone, because the industry that profited from his image had no real plan for what came after it changed. Pendergrass rarely spoke at length about the emotional weight of those years. What he did make clear consistently in the interviews he did give was a refusal to be defined by the accident. He kept working until cancer took his life in 2010, nearly 3 decades after the crash that was supposed to end his career. Pendergrass rebuilt an entire singing technique around a body that no longer worked the way it used to, and did it largely without the industry support that had surrounded him before the crash. If Teddy's tragedy was visible to the entire world, our next artist's was almost completely invisible, hidden inside a mind that was quietly unraveling during some of the most beloved recording sessions in soul music history.
In my life and time.
Number 8. Donny Hathaway, A Song for You. January 13th, 1979, New York City. Donny Hathaway falls from the 15th floor window of the Essex House Hotel. Officials rule it a suicide. He is 33 years old.
I know your image of me.
Now here's the detail that changes everything you thought you knew about his catalog. Hathaway had been privately diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia years before his death. Musicians who worked with him have described sessions interrupted by episodes where he became convinced people in the room meant him harm. Episodes that had nothing to do with the music, and everything to do with a mind fighting to stay anchored to reality while a tape was rolling and a producer was waiting.
Important to me.
This is the same period that produced A Song for You this Christmas. Recordings so warm, so emotionally exact, that people used them every single holiday season without knowing what was happening to the man who made them. There's a particular kind of tragedy in that. Millions of people find comfort in his voice every December, completely unaware that comfort was the last thing its creator had access to while he was making it.
I love you in a place.
Collaborators have said that Hathaway's talent was never in question, even during his hardest stretches. If anything, the opposite was true. Some of his most demanding, technically intricate arrangements were built during periods when he was privately struggling the most. The mind capable of composing that kind of harmonic complexity was the same mind losing its grip on what was real.
Love you in a place.
His family has said publicly, decades later, that they still aren't certain what truly happened in his final moments, and that the ruling of suicide never fully settled the questions they were left with. What is certain is that the audience who loved his voice had absolutely no idea what he was carrying while he made it, because in the late 1970s, mental illness inside the music industry was something you hid, not something you disclosed, let alone treated with the seriousness it deserved.
We were alone and I was singing this song.
The industry around Hathaway had no real framework for what he was going through. There was no structured support, no acknowledgement in the press, nothing beyond concerned colleagues doing their best in a system that simply wasn't built to help. Some of Donny Hathaway's most beloved, most comforting recordings were made during periods when he was reportedly experiencing active symptoms of his illness, meaning the music millions turned to for peace was recorded inside genuine psychological crisis.
And I was singing this song.
If Donny's pain stayed hidden, our next artist's trauma became a punchline, a private tragedy the press turned into tabloid entertainment for years.
I'm so in love with you. Thank you.
Number 7. Al Green, Let's Stay Together. October 18th, 1974. Memphis. Al Green is at home when a woman he'd been involved with, Mary Woodson White, pours a pot of boiling grits across his back during an argument, then takes her own life in another room of the house, minutes later. Green needed hospital treatment for second-degree burns, and the coverage that followed treated it less like the trauma it was, and more like a scandal to be savored. Tabloids ran it for laughs, turning a night that involved real violence and an actual death into tabloid shorthand, a punchline attached to his name for the rest of his career. Almost nobody framed it as what it actually was. A man who had just survived an act of violence followed immediately by a death inside his own home, left to somehow process both at once, in public, under a spotlight he never asked to be under for this particular reason. Within a few years, Green walked away from secular music almost entirely and became an ordained pastor, eventually opening his own church in Memphis. The public story, then and now, was framed as spiritual awakening, a natural evolution for a soul singer discovering faith. What gets left out is the more obvious explanation sitting right there in the timeline. This was survival. This was a man who had nowhere else to put what happened to him, so he built a pulpit instead, a place where the industry couldn't follow him and turn his pain back into content. For years after, interviewers kept bringing the incident back up in interviews, not with compassion, but with curiosity, treating one of the worst nights of his life like a piece of trivia to be revisited whenever a new album needed press. He answered the questions. He rarely complained about being asked them, but the pattern itself says something damning about an entire era of music journalism, one where an artist's trauma was considered fair game as long as it kept people reading.
Let's stay together.
Green's musical transformation in the years that followed is usually told as redemption. Rarely is it told as what it might also have been underneath the redemption. A man quietly rebuilding himself from something the public never fully understood, using the only tools he had left. For over a decade, journalists repeatedly asked Al Green to relive the night a woman died in his home, treating real trauma as recurring content rather than something that had actually happened to a real person. Al's tragedy played out quietly compared to what's coming next. A marriage the entire country watched collapse in real time and profited from every step of the way. Number 6. Bobby Brown, My Prerogative. By the mid-1990s, Bobby Brown wasn't known as a musical pioneer anymore. He was known as the man married to Whitney Houston, a walking punchline in a tabloid storyline that ran for years, reduced to headlines about chaos rather than anything resembling his actual body of work. But rewind further and you find something the coverage buried completely. Brown left New Edition in 1986 and became one of the actual architects of New Jack Swing, the sound that reshaped R&B before hip-hop and soul fully merged into the mainstream. My Prerogative wasn't a novelty hit riding on tabloid infamy. It was a blueprint, released years before the tabloid narrative ever existed, that helped define an entire generation of R&B production. That part of his story got erased by the version the tabloids preferred to sell, because chaos was simply more profitable than crediting him as an innovator. Brown has since spoken openly about decades of substance abuse, an addiction that, by his own account, shaped the environment his children grew up in ways he has expressed real regret over. In 2020, his son Bobby Brown Jr. died of an accidental overdose, a second devastating loss layered directly on top of Whitney's death 8 years earlier. A family marked by tragedy that the public had in some ways been consuming as entertainment long before either death occurred. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. For years, the public consumed Bobby and Whitney's unraveling relationship as entertainment, tabloid fodder, reality TV fuel, a marriage that got its own television show at the exact moment it seemed to be falling apart in front of cameras. Warning signs were treated as ratings opportunities long before anyone in a position to help treated them as a crisis. Brown has said in interviews since that he wishes he had sought help far earlier, and that watching people he loved suffer while cameras profited from documenting it is something he has had to live with for the rest of his life. It's a rare admission from an industry that usually prefers its cautionary tales to stay in the past tense, safely resolved, rather than still being lived through by the person who survived them. Bobby and Whitney's public decline generated ratings and magazine sales for nearly a decade before it was widely acknowledged as a genuine emergency rather than gossip. If Bobby's story shows an industry that mistook a warning sign for entertainment, our next story shows an industry that saw actual violence coming and booked the shows anyway.
She's a very kinky girl.
Number 5. Rick James, Super Freak. In 1991, Rick James, the man behind Super Freak, one of the architects of 1980s funk-driven R&B, was convicted of assault with a deadly weapon and false imprisonment. The case involved a woman he and his girlfriend held against her will over an extended period. He served roughly 2 years in prison. For most of his career, James's persona was built entirely on excess. Audiences read it as performance, a wild, over-the-top character built for the stage, an act designed to shock and entertain. The court transcripts made clear how much of it wasn't performance at all, how the line between the character and the man had blurred until there wasn't really a line anymore. James later admitted, in his own words, that heavy drug use throughout the 1980s had erased large sections of his memory from that entire decade, meaning even he, looking back on his own life, couldn't fully account for years of behavior that fans had cheered for as rock star mythology at the time. What looked like larger-than-life showmanship from the outside was, from the inside, a man who had genuinely lost track of himself. Here's what should really bother you. Insiders have said for years that warning signs around James's behavior circulated inside the industry long before 1991. Bookings didn't stop. Contracts didn't stop. Nobody intervened until a courtroom forced the issue, years after people close to him reportedly already knew there was a serious problem. The industry's silence wasn't ignorance. It was, by multiple accounts, a choice to keep the money moving as long as the behavior stayed out of the courts. James served his sentence, returned to music, and remained largely unapologetic about much of his past in the years that followed, framing his history through the same larger-than-life lens he'd always used, right up until his death in 2004. That refusal to fully reckon with what the court record actually showed is, in its own way, as revealing as the conviction itself. People inside the industry reportedly knew about a pattern of abusive behavior for years before Rick James's 1991 conviction, and nothing changed until the courts made it impossible to ignore. She likes the boys in the band. Rick's story is an industry that looked away for years. Our next story is an industry that looked away for decades, protecting one of the most decorated legends in American music. Number 4. James Brown, Papa's Got a Brand New Bag. James Brown didn't just perform on stage. He redefined what a live performance could physically be, influencing everyone from Michael Jackson to Prince to Bruno Mars decades later. A template for showmanship that outlived him by generations. Off stage, he carried a documented history of domestic violence across multiple relationships and a string of arrests spanning nearly his entire career, including a highly publicized 1988 police chase across 2 states that ended in a prison sentence. For most of his life, allegations from the women closest to him were treated by huge portions of the media as background noise, minor complications in the story of a genius, footnotes squeezed into the margins of profiles that were really about his musical legacy, rather than a pattern that deserved real investigation in its own right. He also battled substance abuse periodically for years, a struggle that ran directly alongside the domestic violence allegations rather than separately from them, feeding into a cycle that those closest to him described as increasingly difficult to interrupt. When he died in 2006, the estate battle that followed dragged through the courts for years, a legal mess so tangled, involving disputed wills and competing family claims, that it exposed exactly how unresolved his personal life still was at the moment of his death. Several women who accused Brown of abuse during his lifetime have said, in the years since, that his stature made it nearly impossible for anyone to take those allegations seriously while he was alive, to push back against them. His fame functioned, in effect, as a kind of shield, one that outlasted the specific women who tried to speak up against it, while he was still able to control the narrative. What makes James Brown's case particularly uncomfortable is how openly some of it was known within the industry, treated as an open secret rather than a hidden one, tolerated for decades because the alternative meant confronting a man whose music had shaped an entire genre. Multiple women who accused James Brown of abuse have said his cultural status made the industry, and much of the public, unwilling to treat their claims as credible until after his death. If James Brown's story is about an industry protecting a legend, our next story is about a public that watched a legend disappear for over a decade and treated the disappearing as content. Number 3, Whitney Houston, I Will Always Love You. February 11th, 2012. A Beverly Hills hotel bathroom. Whitney Houston is found dead in the tub. The coroner rules the cause drowning, with heart disease and cocaine use listed as contributing factors. She is 48 years old. Her struggles with addiction had been public knowledge since at least the mid-1990s, escalating visibly all through the 2000s, in a way that became harder and harder for the industry to frame as speculation. A 2002 interview where she dismissed rumors of drug use became a cultural punchline almost overnight, something people quoted for laughs on talk shows and in headlines, instead of treating as the cry for help it clearly was, at a moment when intervention might have actually mattered.
That is all I am taking with.
And here's the part that's genuinely hard to sit with. Documentaries and reality specials chronicling her visible decline performed extremely well commercially during the exact years those same outlets claimed to be worried about her well-being. The crisis was the content. The concern and the profit were coming from the same place at the same time, packaged and sold to an audience that couldn't look away, while the person at the center of it kept sinking further.
And I hope you have.
Her talent never actually left, even as the narrative around her shifted almost entirely to her decline. Even in her most publicly troubled years, traces of the voice that made I Will Always Love You the best-selling physical single by a woman in music history, were still there, audible in flashes during performances that critics were often too quick to reduce to punchlines. The industry watched her decline in real time for over a decade, and largely just watched, occasionally profiting, rarely intervening in any meaningful structural way. Friends and family who spoke after her death described a woman who had been trying, in fits and starts, to reclaim her life for years, against an industry apparatus that had already decided her comeback narrative was more valuable as tragedy than as recovery. Several commercially successful projects built around Whitney Houston's visible decline were released during the exact years the industry claimed to be concerned about her well-being. Every story tonight has shown fame extracting a cost, Our next one is the most contested chapter in modern music history. A genius whose legacy remains split in half by allegations that have never fully resolved. Number 2. Michael Jackson, Thriller. Thriller remains the best-selling album in American history, and Michael Jackson's influence over the sound and movement of modern R&B and pop is nearly impossible to overstate, reaching into nearly every artist who has topped a chart since. But his adult life became inseparable from serious child sexual abuse allegations, first surfacing publicly in 1993 and settled out of court, then resurfacing in 2003, leading to a 2005 criminal trial where he was acquitted on all counts. These allegations remain deeply, publicly contested to this day, one of the most polarizing subjects in the entire history of popular music. Supporters point to the acquittal and to inconsistencies raised by the defense during the trial, arguing that the legal record should stand as the final word. Critics point to documentaries released after his death that reopened the entire case for a new generation of viewers, presenting accounts that reignited public scrutiny decades after the fact. That divide hasn't closed. It probably never will, and reasonable people continue to land on very different sides of it. Separately, and far more medically documented, is what happened in his final years. Jackson had become dependent on powerful sedatives simply to fall asleep, a dependency his inner circle reportedly knew about, and in some cases enabled, that directly caused his death on June 25, 2009, from acute propofol intoxication. His personal physician was later convicted of involuntary manslaughter for administering the drug in a private bedroom, outside any hospital setting, essentially on nightly call to induce unconsciousness. Say that out loud and it barely sounds real. A licensed physician, sleeping in the house, administering surgical-grade anesthesia every single night, just so one of the most famous human beings alive could close his eyes and get a few hours of rest. It's a detail so extreme that it reads almost like fiction, except it happened, and it was the direct cause of his death. Whatever position anyone takes on the allegations that shadowed his final decades, the medical arrangement that ended his life stands on its own as a stark illustration of what unchecked fame and isolation can do to a person's basic physical safety. Michael Jackson's final years involved a private medical arrangement so extreme, nightly surgical anesthesia administered at home just to induce sleep, that it exposed how far unchecked fame can push a person's body past every reasonable limit. Every story tonight has been about outside forces, the industry, the press, the public. Our final story is different. This one started inside the house. Number 1. Marvin Gaye, What's Going On? April 1st, 1984, Los Angeles. One day before his 45th birthday, Marvin Gaye is at his parents' home on Gramercy Place when an argument with his father, Marvin Gaye Sr., escalates past the point either of them could pull back from. Gaye Sr. shoots his son twice with a .38 caliber revolver. Marvin Gaye is pronounced dead within the hour. Here's the detail that makes this unbearable. That gun was a gift. Marvin gave it to his father himself months earlier, reportedly out of concern for his father's safety, in a house where tension had been building for years between two men who had never fully learned how to coexist. The act meant to protect his family became the exact instrument used to end his life. A piece of irony so cruel it feels almost impossible to say out loud. By 1984, Gaye had already given the world What's Going On in 1971, an album Rolling Stone would later name the greatest ever recorded in any genre, built directly from his brother Frankie's letters home from Vietnam and Gaye's own reckoning with poverty, injustice, and a country tearing itself apart. He'd also delivered Sexual Healing in 1982, a genuine comeback written while wrestling with depression and cocaine dependency in Belgium, where he'd relocated partly to escape mounting debt and family conflict back home, trying to rebuild himself an ocean away from the pressures that had nearly ended his career. The relationship with his father had been strained for decades, marked, by most accounts, by a disapproval Gaye reportedly spent his entire life trying to overturn and never fully did, no matter how much success he achieved or how many records he sold. Marvin Gaye Sr. was a preacher, a man of rigid discipline, and the two had clashed for as long as anyone close to the family could remember. That unresolved war between them ended the way almost nobody could have predicted, with a weapon that was supposed to mean safety, in a house that was supposed to mean home.
People, you know,
The tragedy retroactively reframes nearly everything Gaye ever recorded. Songs about searching for peace, songs about fatherhood, songs about a country and a family both fraying at the seams. What once sounded like observation now sounds, in hindsight, uncomfortably close to forecast. The gun that killed Marvin Gaye was a gift from Marvin to his own father, meaning the very act of trying to protect his family became the instrument of his death. 10 legends, 10 stories the industry, the press, or the public helped bury. And now you know what was actually happening behind the music the whole time.
what's going on?
Every song on this list carries more weight now than it did 10 minutes ago. These stories are like letters mailed to a future version of us, arriving decades late, finally explaining lyrics we thought we already understood. If one of these stories hit you harder than the rest, say which one in the comments, and subscribe. Because we are not done uncovering what the industry tried to keep quiet. The music never lies, even when the industry does.